Hello, everyone. Today I have Whitley here to speak to you about the medical and mental health aspect of encountering UAPs. Whitley, can you please tell people who might not be familiar with your work who you are?
Yeah, I am a writer. I am the author of more books than I can remember almost, or quite a few. My major bestsellers were early on a book called The Wolfen, which was made into a film, then one called The Hunger, which was also made into a film. Then, somewhat later, a book called Majestic, which was not made into a film, which is a novel about the Roswell incident. And then later a book called Superstorm, which was made into the film The Day After Tomorrow, a book called War Day, which was a great bestseller also. And more recently, my books have been a book called Afterlife Revolution about my wife and her presence in the world after she died. A book called A New World, which is an update on my books about the close encounter experience, which I will get to in a moment. And then a book called Jesus, a New Vision, which is a reimagining of the whole Jesus story. Uh, and it's nonfiction. And then currently the book I have out is called Them, which is an analysis of 11 close encounter witness testimonials, and and then in the second part of it, uh, delving into military close encounters and the issues of brain function and trauma that accompany this experience. My own experience started in December of 1985. I we were spending the Christmas at our country house in upstate New York, about 90 miles north of New York City, in a quiet rural area, but not certainly not completely isolated by any means. And uh, the night after Christmas was a very normal, lovely night, snowing lightly, and we'd had a wonderful Christmas. It was myself, my wife, and our 7-year-old son at the house. And in the middle of the night, I was awakened because seemed to be some sort of disturbance in the room. And I opened my eyes and saw immediately that I was not in my room. I was in what I perceived to be a tent. And there was something there which looked like a gigantic insect, the size of a human being almost. And I was very confused. It's not something that I had expected to have in my life. I had never heard of anything like alien abductions. I had thought about flying saucers when I was a little boy back in the 50s when they were in the news all the time. But since then, it simply hadn't been part of my life. I did not think then I didn't immediately think, oh my goodness, I'm with aliens. Not at all. I thought was having a nightmare, and I kept trying to wake up and I couldn't wake up. And it became very physically visceral and real. I suppose I was screaming, but I wasn't aware of this. And because a strange mechanical voice turned on and started saying softly, "What can we do to help you stop screaming? What can we do to help you stop screaming?" over and over again. And at that point, I was shown a needle. I was very restrained. I could not move my body, and I could not. I was like unable to. I had no physical functionality, And the needle was inserted into the side of my head, and I cried out, "You'll ruin a beautiful mind." They didn't stop this thing from happening. Then an object was inserted into my rectum, which was, I later found out, something called uh, uh, a an electrostimulator. Excuse me, I'm a little allergic today. An electrostimulator, which stimulates the nerve that controls the erections. I had an erection and then an ejaculation, which was collected in a small silver tube by one of these strange creatures. And shortly thereafter, I don't have any real memory of anything more, much, a little bit perhaps. And I wound up waking up the next morning feeling like I'd been beaten up, very confused. It was obviously a strange dream. I couldn't put it together at all. I just had this feeling that, excuse me, I'm so sorry. It's a very allergic season for me. I was, I finally decided an owl had gotten into the house because I could remember these great big eyes. And I thought to myself, I told my wife that an owl had gotten in, and she said, "Well, how could that happen?" And it was a good question because all the windows were closed. We didn't have a hearth, and the wood stove was burning. Therefore, nothing could come down the chimney of the wood stove. Ergo, an owl could not have gotten into the house. So then I decided it must have been looking at us through the window in the upstairs bedroom. And I kept thinking I should go up to that window because then if I do, I'll see the tracks the owl left on the sill, because it must have left tracks on the sill in the snow. There was sufficient snow. I kept delaying that. I didn't want to do it. And finally, just as sun was setting, I went up and I looked, and there was no sign of any disturbance whatsoever on the windowsill. And I decided that I had had a psychotic break, or a brain tumor had a temporal lobe brain tumor had caused this vivid hallucination, or something else. The idea of alien contact still didn't occur to me. So uh, over the next few days, I kind of tried to bull it out, and I uh, tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't. It really worried me because it was so vivid. And at this point, what I didn't know was I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I became very irritable. Uh, I decided that I must be had a psychotic break, and that if it happened again, I would maybe never get out of it. And if I didn't get out of it, then my wife would be left with a husband in a mental institution and a little boy to raise, and no means of getting rid of the husband or getting money. So I started trying to convince her to leave me. And the next few weeks were very, very difficult. Uh, I was finally, by the time another 2 or 3 weeks had passed, I had a narrative in my mind. I remembered being in the woods and seeing these strange people in bodysuits with headdresses on, with round goggles and a round thing here. And I recalled seeing a friend who had been in the Central Intelligence Agency with him. And I had written a politically controversial book called War Day. And I thought to myself, have I been drugged by some kind of crazy CIA people who resented War Day? And because I remembered him very well, I hadn't seen him since school days, college, but I did know he had gone to the Central Intelligence Agency. So I telephoned him, and the line was disconnected. And I thought, aha. So I phoned his brother, and his brother said he had died the previous March. In other words, I'd seen him there, big as life, when he had actually been dead for 9 months. So I decided, well, you're definitely completely crazy, Whitley. And I went to the doctor and I told him all of this. And the doctor was the first one to bring up aliens. He said, Whitley, you're telling me you think you were taken aboard a flying saucer by little men. And I thought, my God, that is what it sounds like. And so he said, we need to do some tests. And I said, obviously, because it never crossed the mind of either of us that anything like that could be true, any reality to it at all. So I underwent tests for an MRI scan. I underwent a bank of psychological tests. And about a month after that, I did a test for temporal lobe epilepsy. I did all of these tests, and they all came out normal, except the psychological test, which said that I was under a great deal of stress, which was obviously true. And I was just at a loss. I couldn't imagine what had happened. I went out into the woods to look for evidence of being there, and there was nothing. It was just, you couldn't see anything unusual, but I did pretty well know where I had been taken up. And it was just so odd, all of it. And I couldn't get it out of my mind. I was fighting with my wife. And then my brother happened to have sent me a book for Christmas called Science and the UFOs. And I was not interested in that and hadn't planned to read the book. But now I thought to myself, it did look like that, didn't it? It seems, when Tom said I was taken aboard a flying saucer, that's what it sounds like when I talk about it. So I read the book, and damned if it wasn't at the end of the book, there was this story of an alien abduction and a man called Bud Hopkins who was studying them. I looked him up in the phone book, and it said he lived in New York, and it turned out he lived a few blocks from us in Greenwich Village. So Anne and I went to see him. And he said that what I was describing was something that had happened to many people. And that's where it began. Since then, I eventually, before we'd gone to see Bud, I told Anne that I thought I had been taken aboard a flying saucer by little men. And her reaction was absolutely priceless. She said, "Oh, thank God. I thought you were going crazy." And I thought to myself, boy, I,
Wow.
I married the right woman. Um, so that's where it started. That is, and it's an accurate description of the trauma, both physical and mental. I didn't mention the rectal probe incident, which caused a severe lesion in my rectum. It tore my rectum, an injury I suffered from for the next 20 years or more. And I also had the experience of, after I innocently went public with this, what seemed to me fascinating story by that point, it would turn out to be a national or an international joke, and I would become known as the rectal probe man. And I've had the experience of having my rape laughed at by millions of people for years. That's also been a big part of the trauma for me.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know it's not easy to go through and remember all those things. Um, and I feel like you did an excellent job of covering a lot of that. I think people from the medical community would be interested if you don't mind saying a little bit about what kind of test besides the MRI you would recommend for someone who went through something like that. Um, what were the different assessments that they did?
Well, I think that some kind of neurological workup. And there was also, I might mention, a neurological workup in with a neurologist with as well as the MRI scan. I think that's a very important baseline. I think also now that this is out in the public space, that people who have other traumatic experiences that they don't want to face are liable to claim them as alien abduction experiences, especially people who have had uh, uh, child abuse are going to liable to say that they had alien abductions when it's really was child abuse. I think that could be a serious problem. The other test, there was the usual battery of psychological tests. I don't remember the names of them all, but it was a standard battery of psychological tests that basically assess well-being and uh, uh, look for signs of uh, psychotic process, and that also tested things like intelligence. And um, the temporal lobe epilepsy test was a very aggressive one that included leads in the nose and an aggressive attempt to cause the brain to seize. And there was no seizure. It was diagnosed as an exceptionally stable brain because of the aggressiveness of the test. Um, the uh, so those were the tests I took, as well as, of course, a physical and a whole body of tests designed to determine my physical state, my mental state, and my neurological condition and state. This was what was done, and it all
You
came out, in my case, normal.
Thank you so much. You have also shared publicly that at some point you were given an implant. We don't have a lot of people coming forward to talk about that. Could you please explain that to people who are listening?
Well, that's not a short explanation, but I can certainly give it to you. The implant is lodged here. It's right under my finger right now. In May of 1989, at the cabin, the I was awake. It was about 11 o'clock at night. I was reading. My wife was asleep in the bed beside me when I heard gravel crunching in the driveway. The situation was this: we were at the country house. The bedroom spanned the house and had open windows over the back and front of the house. And I was lying in bed reading, and I heard the crunching of gravel in the driveway. We had a shale gravel driveway, and there was a substantial gate closing the place, the driveway, some distance from the house. And the crunching gravel was not accompanied by any car lights, meaning to me that there was an intrusion occurring. I had two weapons. I had a shotgun under the bed and a pistol in the bedside table. Beside the bed, there was an array of lights that could, if you just flip them all on, they would completely flood the house with floodlights. There were floodlights all around the house. And so as I stirred, I heard a voice from the window in the back, a male voice say quietly, "Condition red." And I was moving to turn on the lights when I heard that voice, and then at the same moment saw, standing near the foot of the bed, a man and a woman who had entered the house. I also saw that the LED on the alarm system, which was at that point the most sophisticated one you could buy, was still red, indicating it was still armed, even though they had come into the house, obviously. And instead of going for the lights, I started to reach for the shotgun. At that point, they rushed forward. The woman, I ended up on my side, black. I couldn't see anything. My was lying on my side, and a hand was pressing very hard against my uh, uh, yeah, I'm sorry, against this side, like this, pressing very hard and in waves. And the woman's voice was speaking softly, reassuringly. And this ended abruptly. There was a great deal of crashing in the woods and a big flash of light. And I jumped out of bed, grabbed the pistol, and ran off into the house, trying to run down whoever it had been there. I ran through the whole house. I even went the basement, the attic, everywhere. There was no sign of entry, and there was certainly no sign of anyone there. So I went back and ended up sitting on the side of the bed trying to remember. I'd heard something about lucid dreams and had read about them. And I thought, this seemed so physical. It's hard to believe it was a dream at all. But I couldn't figure out what else it could be. So I slept fitfully for the rest of the night and told Anne about it in the morning. We found, as I was leaving to pick up the newspaper, since it wasn't delivered to our house and we usually would pick it up every day, I found that the garage door was wide open. And the alarm system was still triggered. It was still armed. So I called the man who ran the alarm man, and he came over and he said there is a very powerful magnetic field in the garage that's causing it's so powerful that the switch didn't trip, and there's no source for it at all. There was no source for this magnetic field, and he replaced the switch. That was all he could do. We tried looking at the alarm system's records, but they had been scrambled, so you couldn't tell anything from them. The digital record, I mean. Then the next day, this began. I'm sorry, folks. If you understand, this is reversed when you're looking at yourself. So I keep going to the wrong side for that reason. The next couple of days, this area began to hurt. And I knew about implants by then. I wasn't unfamiliar with them. And I had heard stories of them and so forth. And I talked to a Dr. Roger Lear in California who had been extracting them from people. And it was there, and it was obviously an implant. But it hadn't been put in by aliens. It had been put in by people. They even were talking in the backyard. So what could it mean? Annie thought we should try to use it and to try to see if it did anything. I wanted to get it out of me. Of course, it was in me, not her, and she didn't have to worry about the creepy feeling that it gave me, which was a feeling of being tracked or watched and so forth. And she finally said, Whitley, nobody cares if you go down to the store and buy a quart of milk. So therefore, if it's a tracking device, they're wasting their time. It's something else, and that's what's interesting. About 2 years later, I finally said, look, we'd moved down to Texas at that point and left the cabin behind. Due to lack of money, we couldn't keep it. And a doctor showed up who was willing to try to get rid of it, to take it out for me, to take it out. And he did a little surgery on it, opened it up. And when he did open it up, he saw, and this is all on videotape. You can find it on my website, on unknowncountry.com. He opens it up, and it, he sees he and my wife both saw it. It was a white disc, and he touched it with his scalpel, and it immediately moved on its own down from the pinna into the earlobe. And he closed the incision because it obviously couldn't take off my whole ear. So that was that. He did get a sliver of it, which was sent to a lab. And the lab technician reported that it appeared to be a piece of metal with motile cilia attached to it, cilia that were moving attached to it. So it was obviously some kind of biotechnological object. 2 or 3 days after it had come down here, there was a great pain in my ear, a lot of fiery pain, and as it moved back up to where it is now. It remained quiescent for years. After my wife passed away, a slit opened in this eye, and the slit in the showed you could see words racing through this neat oblong slit, like they were being typed by a speed typist. And I have gradually learned to use this thing as it's a research tool, among other things. And I'm sure they're not whoever put it in is not interested in whether or not I went down to get a bottle of milk, but it has been the central means by which I have researched all of the books I've written since 2015. Afterlife Revolution, A New World, Jesus, A New Vision, and them. And it has greatly enhanced my abilities to do research because it works in a very strange way. All you have to do is think about what you need, and one way or another, you find it. It comes to you, either in memory or in the mind, or in a kind of synchronicity that's quite amazing. And it's so consistent that it's not an accident. It's consistent now over, 5 books. And it's just incredibly useful. If you look into those books, you'll find a real depth of research that wouldn't be possible without it. So
And I believe you've also said that it can be detected, the implant can be detected externally through radio frequencies and it's disruptive to electronics. Is that correct?
no, I did. I may have suggest. I don't know if I've said that directly. I don't think so. I have said that there was one that was studied by Dr. Lear, that was emitting an FM frequency. It's not this one. This one has never been emitting a frequency, so that we've ever detected. It does, however, um, it has a lot of functionality without doing that. The radio frequency one was a very interesting story. By that time, I had become intensely interested in these things, as you may imagine. This was about in 92 or 93. I I was living in San Antonio, and a friend of mine, family, called Tom Slick, had founded something called the Southwest Research Institute. He was a very wealthy man and founded a scientific institute, as well as something called the Mind Science Foundation, which was designed to explore the edges of mental research into the nature of the mind. And that, but the Southwest Research Institute at that point was 50% funded by Central Intelligence Agency and 50% by endowment, and had an enormous materials science division run by a man named William Mallow, and the niece of of Tom Slick, who was, of course, on the board of the foundation, uh, knew me well. We grew up together, so we knew each other very well. And I said to her that I thought that perhaps these implant study would be interesting. And eventually, the foundation very unwillingly agreed to let Dr. Mallow study these objects with the foundation's equipment, but not to but not to put anything on foundation letterhead. So that was the basis under which we studied these objects, and we studied quite a few of them. Most of them were taken out of people's calf muscles or their arms or various different parts of their body, and they were all quite consistent. They were all meteoric iron. We were studying them under the scanning electron microscope and in other ways, and they never emitted any signal until we found one that did. Dr. Lear said we have found one that is emitting a very low level FM signal. So they identified the signal and sent us the implant. And we observed it under the scanning electron microscope. And it was the same nickel iron, but Bill and I talked about it. We thought if it is emitting, it wasn't at this point emitting a signal, not after it was outside of the body. If it was emitting a signal, then there surely must be some kind of crystal formation inside that nickel iron that would have modulated the signal, because we knew that it could have been generating. There could have been piezoelectric energy generated by the object in some way. I don't quite understand where he was going with that. I'm not a physicist or an electronics expert. So we decided to take it and have it analyzed under an X-ray diffraction machine. Now, what this would have done is it diffracted again and again and again, rotating around it until it would build up a picture of the interior of the object. And conceivably, but since it was iron, it would not be particularly good, but we thought it might give us something. We couldn't think of anything else to do. The following thing happened. We put it in the diffractor, and the analyst was the man who ran the diffractor I should say. And it diffracted once, the machine beeped. Then the next cycle, there was nothing. It didn't beep. So we ran it 10 or 15 times, and there's no more sound. It was not returning X-rays anymore, and it was a piece of iron, so why wouldn't it be? We took it back to the SEM, and it was still the same constitution it had been, a piece of nickel iron. We put it in the X-ray diffraction machine for 36 hours, and it never returned another signal. It had become X-ray invisible, and there was nothing about its constitution that we could see that had changed in any way. But it
So
never again
if
was it.
so if someone was interested in the findings from that research, is there a publication available to look at that data?
When you're dealing with something that is being resisted by an organization as powerful as the United States government, the simple answer is not much. I have a little bit of material that I managed to get from Bill Mallow, but this object, like the sliver of the implant that was taken out of my ear, all disappeared. He would take them in his office, and then he would say that they had been lost because he was giving them to intelligence officials who were taking them into what is a very large hidden system of where these things are analyzed and then being compelled to tell us they had been lost. So no is the answer.
Okay. If someone has an implant and is not aware of it, but suspects that it is the case, is there a way for them to detect that? For instance, other than a bump on the skin, you said that a lot of these objects were iron. Is there a way to like put a magnet nearby to detect magnetic
Yeah,
action?
something as simple as a stud finder can detect them, because they're metal, they're iron, and most of them are magnetic. They most have a magnetic field around them. When they're removed, they are generally found to be encapsulated. They're usually in deep muscle tissue, and they are encapsulated in a capsule of epidermis. And very often on the body of the person, you can find another place where there's a slight scoop mark where that subcutaneous epidermal tissue has been taken in order to encase the iron in it, so that when the iron is implanted in the body won't reject it, because the body is only sees its own tissue. So since the body can't generate, it doesn't have the genetic coding to generate epidermal tissue inside deep muscle, it's pretty hard to argue that this was done accidentally, or that the body simply encased it in if it encased it in anything, it would be something more like calcium, but that's not what happens. So uh, if a person thinks they have an implant, there's nothing that can be done except to, I think, if they might try something that detects um, magnetism, or something that detects conceivably radio signals, very very sensitive, because the signal would be very low. Then, but the definitive thing would be X-ray, and then the removal of these objects is really an art in itself. Dr. Lears, sadly enough, has passed away, and the reason being that mine wasn't the only one that ran for cover when it was an attempt was made to remove it. That's a common part of this. If an attempt is made to remove them, they move away, and that has to be understood by the surgeon, or they will lose them.
Yeah, I was fortunate to read Dr. Lear's book, and the precautions that they took, and he broke down some more details on what was involved with these objects. If anyone wants to look further into the implant aspect, so
It's
Whitley, I'm
called
gonna
the alien and the scalpel, I believe.
yes, Whitley, I'm gonna switch to the psychology aspect with the time we have left, if we can, for a moment. I do also want your summary because you're fortunate in having had so much correspondence from people. For those who are not aware, the letters written to Whitley after communion came out are at Rice University. Number of people came forward to share their experiences. And I imagine that some patterns were evident related to the medical and mental health aspects. But before we get into that, I just wanted to talk in your book Communion, you did touch on, the psychological aspect to this confusion. What do you think would have been helpful for you in dealing with this trauma?
It would have been very helpful if I had access to a therapist who would listen uncritically and open-mindedly, and not assume that I was bringing a known form of uh, psychological dysfunction the the to the relationship, because it's going to be a very difficult thing for any professional to untangle. and it goes back to what I spoke about briefly earlier, which is that people will conflate trauma that they don't want to face into alien abduction. When I was this was happening to me, of course, that wasn't possible because I had no idea about alien abduction until later, and I met Bud Hopkins. However, what did happen, and I was unaware of this, was that I had post-traumatic stress disorder for many years, and it colored my life profoundly. It made me irritable, short-tempered, uh, uneasy, and all of the things that PTSD does happened to me. And I don't think I would have had the financial problems that I had that developed if I had not had PTSD, undiagnosed PTSD. So I think that the first thing a therapist should do in the diagnosis period is to determine if there is a level of PTSD present in the patient, because that to me would be a sign that this individual has experienced trauma of some kind. And then you have the difficulty of recovered memory and confabulated memory, which I go into fairly extensively in my book, Them, because it it becomes really very difficult to determine whether a person is remembering something that really happened or is gotten their memory somehow distorted. And in the book, I examine 11 of I think there must be about 25 or 30,000 letters at Rice. And there were a couple of 100,000 that were sent to us. And Anne, God love her, had the foresight to cull out the ones with longer descriptions and keep them in files. And that's what's at Rice. Uh, many of them, only a few of them have ever even been typed, and they have not been digitized because they have to be taken from a handwritten form to a typed form and then digitized, and that's quite an expensive process. So that hasn't happened. And uh, the 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 level of trauma and whether or not the trauma is really related to these unknown experiences, it's going to be a tremendous challenge to sort that out. I've known more than one person who's, in my non-professional eye, has seemed to me to be conflating things. And generally, the ones that seem to be conflating things you'll find that they have alien friends and usually have a, a wonderful relationship with some alien who has a name and who comes to see them and so forth. This isn't like that. And as soon as you sit down and begin to read these letters, you realize two things. One, the experience, three things. One, the experience is incredibly varied. It's not just abductions at all. In fact, that's not even the major thrust of it. Two is, it is so strange, it is literally beyond imagining. I don't think that these are things that could be spontaneously imagined by anyone. A lot of them, most of them. And three, it's a very traumatic experience for a lot of people, even though they might not have been injured physically as I was. The trauma comes from being drawn out of their usual milieu into this impossible situation. Just like, I mean, when you pull a fish up out of the water, even if you put the fish back in again, the fish is going to experience extraordinary trauma from being drawn completely out of its known habitat. And that's exactly what happens. It's not simply a matter of being taken aboard a flying saucer and, that's another habitat. It's not another habitat. It's not another human place at all. And the way the brain works uh, we are drawing in impressions through our senses at all times, and the brain is comparing, using its enormous filing system to compare those impressions to impressions it has already cataloged. That's how a baby, comes up out of amnesia, by doing that. That's the brain doing that. Now, suddenly, when an adult is faced with impressions that the brain can't catalog, chaos results and trauma emerges for sure. And you can see that in a lot of these letters of people who did not have abduction experiences. You'll see that after their experience, which seemed to be, in some cases, not all that traumatic, they developed physical symptoms of extreme trauma. And there's one letter in particular in them called Visitors in the Trees, where an entire family had a 2-day encounter experience that was at the ultimate edge of high strangeness. And but they didn't experience a sense of trauma during this process at all. It was more curiosity than anything. However, afterwards, the children began to grind their teeth. The mother, who had the most experience, ended up in the hospital with dehydration and all kinds of problems. People's hair fell out. And this was all, none of this trauma was apparent to these people while the event was unfolding. It was only afterwards that the physical emergence of the trauma occurred. Because when the brain can't catalog something, and it does not deal with it well at all. Not at all.
I wanted to address trauma in a different perspective. You said that sometimes people may be misremembering childhood abuse, but some people in the community have expressed that the phenomenon may be attracted to people who are traumatized. Sometimes people are in the midst of a trauma when the phenomenon engages with them. So, do you think that perhaps there's something to that, that they're looking for people who have a vulnerability, that they're attracted to that?
Well, that's a very good question. And let me address it from a personal level. In 1952, I was recruited into a program being run by the United States Air Force, which was an accelerated learning program. I was 7 years old, and I don't have any memory of the recruitment and very little memory of the program, but I can tell you a little bit about it. However, I have probably my closest friend in the world was also recruited for it, and he was 9 and in the living room when the Air Force personnel arrived to pitch his parents to get him into this program. They had 3 or 4 children selected in the program based on IQ, and the whole city had been, and this had probably happened in other cities too. I don't think San Antonio was but I assume it wasn't the only one. Had been All the children had been given IQ tests, and the ones that were of the right age, 7 to 9 or 7 to 10, I think it was, and who had exceptionally high IQs were recruited. And I was recruited, and my friend was recruited. And he is, by the way, a very successful man, and he's used his great intelligence more wisely, I think, than I have. In any case, um, the recruiters told his parents that a Skinner box would be involved in this accelerated learning program, and on that basis, they refused to allow him to go into it. My parents, I don't remember anything about being present when this recruiting took place, were apparently either not told that, or they weren't aware of what it meant, or they just accepted it. I was in the program from August of 1952 through October and I began to get sick. And it developed that my immune system had broken down from the stress. And I don't remember very much about that. I only remember loud sounds, to be honest with you. And uh, I have tried writing about it to try to bring up some memories, but it hasn't worked. So I was taken out of the program, and an attempt was made to rehabilitate my immune system by giving me gamma globulin shots at Brooke General Hospital in San Antonio, the military hospital there. And I was isolated at home and kept out of school until January, when my white blood count had returned to normal. So that was an extraordinary childhood stress, because to stress a child enough to cause that to happen, a physical effect like that, that's serious stress. And if that happened to people all over the country the same thing was done to them, they would have all been similarly stressed. The visitors showed up in my life 2 years later, when I was 9. And I've had the experience of my father facilitating it, the contacts with them. So it was all very extraordinary. And the contacts with them weren't stressful when I was a child. They were only stressful later. Um, but yes, stress, early childhood stress. Ken Ring wrote a book called The Omega Project, I believe, in which he studied a group of close encounter witnesses. He's a psychologist. And he found that childhood trauma of some kind was the only single thing in their personality profiles that seemed to be a consistent sign that they would have these experiences. It's as if an early childhood experience of the impossible and the traumatic cracks the cosmic egg.
I try to be optimistic and see it as once you've experienced trauma, your perspective changes, you become a little bit more aware, and your brain may have adapted in a different way to reality. Um, I've gone through a couple serious traumas myself, and I have felt that sense of reality not being what I thought it was before. So I suspect there's more to it than people realize. I just wanted your perspective, so thank you for sharing. Um, and we have only a few minutes left, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to medical and mental health providers on what you think they should be doing at this stage, especially at the stage where the government is coming out and admitting that something is going on. What would you want from people when they're faced with someone coming into their office as an experiencer?
Put your assumptions in a drawer and close it. That's the first thing. Uh, the second thing is to try to use your array of knowledge of trauma to identify exactly what this person is trying to tell you, understanding that the one thing that isn't going to happen is they're not going to give you, or they may actually, but you can't know, a clear narrative of what actually happened, for a couple of reasons. First, it's traumatic, and that in itself, it causes distortions. Uh, Second, a lot of it is totally novel experience, and that is hard to remember, and when it is remembered, it's often very distorted. And third is the phenomenon itself distorts memory. There is a study called the Condign Report, which I discuss in some length in my book, Them. It was uh, produced by British intelligence agencies in the late 90s. It's not the Condon Report. That's a different thing, the Air Force report on UFOs. Uh, in the late 80s, I mean, in the late 90s, excuse me. which discusses the fact that being in the presence of what they had to call plasmas in the report because they couldn't say UFOs and expect it to be expect anyone to read it. Uh, in the presence of these plasmas, people's will end up remembering things that did not happen. So you have to take all of that into consideration, and it's quite important, I think, to just let the person's narrative flow and to try to find the the the, the way the traumatic aspects work into and are reflected in that narrative without trying to uh, nail down exactly the degree to which the narrative fits some kind of reality, because there has never been an independent observer in a situation where they could observe a person interacting with this presence or this visitors or whatever they are. Therefore, there's no baseline. Without a baseline, you just have to be open-minded to it and to use your skills to try to determine if this is something like hidden childhood trauma of abuse or something else. And certainly wouldn't recommend anything like hypnosis because not that it's useless, it's not useless, but it's just very, very hard to use under these circumstances. Very hard. And even harder now because there's this whole public narrative. And, even if the hypnotist is a skilled professional psychologist and does not ask leading questions, the society and the culture have already asked those questions for the subject. So you don't even need to worry about it. The subject's going to follow suggestions that have been pre-implanted by what he's read and heard and in the culture.
It's interesting that you say that because one thing that people have said is that the cover of your book, a lot of people had probably seen something similar, but basically adopted that image because their distortion of what they were seeing like was too difficult to handle. So they went with that's the image. I'm going with that. My brain will accept that. That's what I saw. Is that your perception of it?
Well, I it's what I saw, and it triggered memories in an enormous number of people. And I've never been certain. If you look back in the early years of Western culture, you find, and you can find them even in some rock art. You find these faces with huge eyes, the eye gods of the Sumerians. And there's a fascinating book called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by a man named Julian Jaynes, who was criticized because it's a book of speculation. It's not based on any certain knowledge, because it can't be, because what happened, what he's talking about are things that happened in the distant past, and there's no one left alive to study, obviously. But it's a fascinating concept that we are somehow or another drawn to or hypnotized by these big eyes, and that the people who created the statues in the past knew this, and that's why they made these eyes so arresting, because they knew they would they would be powerful and affect the viewer profoundly.
Yeah.
And
I
the
was going to
eyes you see in the close encounter experience function in exactly the same way.
And it's also the shape of the head. In Egypt and in Peru, the elongated skull, and actually some cultures still purposely elongate skulls, fascinated humans. And one thing I have to say, I've just have to throw this out there. I've said before, if this intelligence thinks that the idea of these big eyes and elongated skulls is the best way to communicate with us, they may have misstepped a little bit. That's very frightening to people.
When you read them, you find that it's obviously fumbling for some way to communicate usefully with us. And it's not necessarily succeeding, and it's not because they don't know us. It's because I'm quite sure. Let me get this picture just a minute. We're talking about the old lady. There she is. This is the original painting. Um, uh, if if they're fumbling around trying to get through to us in some way, but also to control us in some way, and I think that's quite clear they are. Uh, this may be something that they hit upon by looking at our cultures, or it may be that they just look like this, and it may be that they've been here a long time, and the early eye gods and so forth are reflections of their presence in the world. Those are all unanswerable questions. And they don't really matter in a great deal, because if you're trying to help somebody who's traumatized, your objective is to enable them to uh, uh, to relieve the pain. I mean, that's pain relief is what that type of medicine is about. And you don't need to know the details of what happened in order to do that in this case. What you do need to know is how the trauma works in that particular personality. And a good therapist can always find that out. You don't need to know whether or not it was aliens or anything like that. You don't even need to
Yeah.
address
I appreciate you saying that because I've said that all along. The why is not as important in care.
it.
The
Exactly.
Yeah, we wouldn't ask someone to give us all the details from an abuse situation either. We would be treating the after effect. So
Yes.
I think people need to understand the why is something that you can be open to listening to, but that's not the main purpose of treatment. So thank you, Whitley, for coming and giving me your time today, for speaking to the UAP Medical Coalition about these issues. Where can someone reach you if they have more questions or if they want to know more about your case and just your background? Where can they reach you?
The simplest way is to simply write whitley@strieber.com, and that will get through to me. And I do read all of my email. I read probably up to 1,000 emails a week, and I answer as many as I can. And I certainly will engage with professionals if at all possible. And I'm here, and it's there's no charge, obviously.
Mhm. Thank you again. And truly, I think everyone appreciates that you were brave enough to come forward and talk about what happened to you in your life. And I think it, you know, people see that as um, a step forward for them too. Hopefully, more people will be open to having these conversations.
Well, thank you for saying that I was brave enough to come forward, but I wasn't. I simply thought it was a fascinating kind of minor thing. I didn't have any the slightest idea that there were all these people involved, and it was a huge part of life. If I'd known that before I wrote Communion, I might not have written it.
Well, you did, and you're here, and we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay. And for everyone listening, thank you and take care.